Welcome to the 2020 series of free webinars sponsored by the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, CASP, the Quebec Association for Suicide Prevention, IQPS, and the Centre for Research and Intervention on Suicide, Ethical Issues, and End-of-Life Practices at the Université du Québec à Montréal, known as CRIS. These are the dates when we initially had planned for the National Conference on Suicide Prevention to be held at the Université du Québec à Montréal in Montreal, Quebec. Because of COVID, of course, that event has to be rescheduled for October 27th to the 29th, 2021 in Montreal, with a pre-conference activities being held on the 26th. Please mark those dates in your calendars and look at the website of CASP, IQPS, and CRIS for future information about this major national event. I'm Julie Kathleen Campbell, and I'm from CASP. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Brian Michara, Director of CRIS and Professor of Psychology at the Université du Québec in Montreal, UQAM. His current research projects include a study on how to best help frequent callers to suicide prevention helplines, the determination of best suicide prevention practices using text messaging and chat, a community follow-up project to prevent repeated suicide attempts in Nunavut, and ethical issues in medical assistance in dying your relationship between suicide and MAID. I'm also introducing Louis-Philippe Côté, PhD candidate in psychology at UQAM and a member of CRIS. His research interest focuses on the use of new technologies in suicide prevention. Among other projects, he has studied the behaviors of suicidal internet forum users, investigated the presence of suicide-related content on the darknet, and coordinated the evaluation of the Crisis Services Canada SMS intervention pilot project. They will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we will have a 20-minute question and answer. It's very important that if you have any questions for the presenter, that you write them in the Q&A or QNR, depending on your Zoom language, at the bottom of your screen. Not the chat, but the Q&A. The presenters will not directly read the questions. They will spend their time concentrating on the presentation. However, I will read all the questions, and at the end of the presentation, I will select questions and ask them to the presenters. The total time for the presentation and question period will be 1 hour, and we should finish no later than 5 minutes after the hour. Note that all presentations are being recorded, and you will be able to access them some weeks from now on the website of the three organizers, so CASP, IQPS, and CRIS. I will now invite the presenters to begin the webinar.
Greetings from Montreal. I'm Brian Michara, and I'll be presenting, and Louis-Philippe will be adding some comments as we go on. And Luc Tagis is hiding somewhere in the background. He also contributed substantially to this presentation. Okay, and I need to click on it. So, you know, who are frequent callers? In the old days, before we had politically correct language, we called them chronic callers. And if you look for writing about frequent callers in the 1970s or even 80s, you'll find that they're called chronic callers. This is considered pejorative. Now we call them frequent callers or frequent users. Some have suggested we call them loyal callers to not to give them some support. There is also terminology of repeat callers, meaning anyone who calls repeatedly, which usually can mean more than once. For example, in Australia, where they have very good national data, 3% of the callers, so 1 out of 33 or so, call more than 20 times per month, but 60 the calls from this 3% constitute 60% of all the calls that they receive. So one of the questions one can ask is, what's a frequent caller? How many calls has it been frequent? One study, for example, said their frequent callers were people called more than 19 times in 2 years. If someone calls those 19 times during 1 week, that's fairly frequently perhaps, but if it's spread out once every month or so, doesn't sound very frequent to me. Usually, one of the most common recent definitions is more than 20 times a month. But even if you have that as a definition, you're going to be having callers with very different call patterns. If someone calls 20 times in 1 week, that's, a few times a day. But if the 20 times are spread out over the month, it might be a bit less, but that's becoming what's accepted as being frequent. Just to put you in the in the context, Julie, you're sharing a screen or something. I'm having someone is on a un problème technique avec le partage d'écran. Je partage. OK, je vais tenter encore.
L'écran est plus partagé.
OK, je vais l'essayer encore. OK, here we go. So I'm just going to play some typical call types. Just give you some sense of it. This is the second call from this caller that day. And these are based on real calls. Crisis Center. This is Jack here. Who am I talking to?
This is Melly.
Melly?
Melly.
Melly. Hi, Melly. How you doing?
Oh, it's terrible. I want to move.
Yeah. We actually talked about this morning.
I'm not getting anywhere. I just want to move. It's awful here.
Yeah, I know. It's just terrible. You're feeling so frustrated about moving, and it's something you want to do so badly, but you seem a little bit blocked.
Oh, I just want to get out of here. I want to get out of here. It's killing me.
Oh,
you don't realize how bad it is here. I just got to get out of here.
Oh, it's so frustrating. You just want so much to move, but it just don't seem to be able to do it.
Can you help me? I got to get out of here. Can you do something about this?
Well, you've been thinking about a number of things that we're talking about before. You were going to, if I remember correctly, you were going to talk to that agent that you met and try to look for a place. Have you called the agent back?
Oh, he doesn't like me. I got to get out of here.
He doesn't like you?
I don't know. He wasn't very friendly.
Well,
I just got to get out of here. I don't know.
Well,
Can't you help me?
I thought the agent said to call back, and you were supposed to call him back, and he was going to give you some listings of places you could move to.
Oh I just don't know if I can manage it.
Yeah. And okay. Donc, so that's second call of the day. It went on, and then a little later, this is another call, same person, that calling back.
Crisis Services. This is Jack speaking. Who am I talking to?
Hi, it's Melly. You know, I really
hi,
do have to
Melly.
move. I have to move. I mean, this place is really getting to me. I think of all the terrible things, and I gotta get out of here. I really just have to get out of here.
Yeah, I understand. We've been talking about this for quite a while. In fact,
You're right, Jack.
We talked about it twice this morning. I'm just wondering if you, the last two times we talked about you calling back that agent who you seem to like, and
But what if he doesn't like me?
well,
What if he doesn't find me a nice place?
Well, I guess you need to give it a try first, don't you?
Well, do you think he'll remember me?
Well, give it a try. I think you should call him. You said you were going to call him this morning and yesterday, and actually, I think
I hate
we've been
leaving a
talking about it
message
for
on
a
the
couple of
phone.
weeks now.
It's so great when I call you, you pick up and you talk. And leaving a voicemail makes me, I don't know, it just makes me...
You don't get through to the agent when you call?
No, I have to leave a voicemail. And, you know, what if I'm out on the stoop when he calls, or...
Well,
I don't know.
Maybe we could practice doing voicemail. Would that help?
Okay. All right.
Okay. Pretend you're calling the agent and there's no answer. What are you going to leave as a message?
This is Melly, and I need a new place to live, and I don't have enough money for the security deposit usually, and I have a lot of stuff, and
excuse me, could I just make a suggestion? Maybe I could suggest that you just say, this is Melly, and I'm calling back and about the apartment you were looking for me, and then just leave your phone number without explaining everything to him. How about that? Want to give it a try?
Okay, I'll try. Oh, thanks, Jack. I get so nervous. I just gotta get out of here and...
to do some of the breathing exercises we were talking about. Okay, let's do the call. Try again. Okay. Pretend you call the phone.
Okay.
Get an answering message, and then.
Hi, this is Melly, and Jack told me to call you because you might have an apartment for me to move into.
Okay, and now another call, fourth call, a little later that day, and someone who calls, every day.
Crisis Services. Who am I talking to? This is Jack speaking.
Jack, it's Melly.
Hi, Melly.
I don't know. I was up all night thinking about it. I really have to move. I really have to. I mean, it's so much work, but I have to.
Yeah, I understand. We talked about it.
Yeah, you're right.
Morning.
I really have to move.
I took your call this morning, and this is the fourth time you called today.
I know. It helps so much talking with you. You're right. I have to. I do have to move.
Well, yeah, and we were talking about you calling the agent today. Have you called the agent yet?
I really have to call him. You're right. I have to call him. I just get so scared. It's so much work.
I wish I could talk with you more, but you were limited to 2 calls a day.
I know, but I might need more, Jack.
And you've already, I don't know how it happened that you called 3 times already.
Do you think that the agent can help me? Do you really think so?
I think so, but I'm going to have to end the call. We have a lot of people in crisis now.
I know. I'm not the only one, but you help me so much. We're going to
have to limit the calls, and you can call back again tomorrow morning and let us know how you're doing. Good luck to you.
Oh. Thanks, Jack.
Okay. So, that's one example of a frequent caller. There are all different things. But I think that, the main concern is one, capacity issues. If 3% of the people are calling 60% of the time, and the second is just the emotional drain or frustrations, and concern by the staff that the same people are basically talking about the same things. You can imagine getting a call from that woman, Melly, talking about having to move as many times as she's allowed to call a day, and have that go on for 9 months, and without so much progress, perhaps, or so that sometimes staff feel that people are manipulating or bored, need human contact, or may not be in a suicidal crisis. Those are the sorts of things that have been written about. And there's a question of whether or not helplines are actually helpful for them. So the some of the issues in question, most of the writings talk about a need for management. And management sounds like, you're handling a problem. So there's something pejorative already when we talk that what we want to do is manage them. But most of what people mean by management is either reducing or stopping having them call for helplines that find that they're not sure they're being of help, or this doesn't fit in with their mandate. Or talk about needing better approaches for helping them. One of the questions is, are they really at risk of suicide, or they use the suicide or talk about suicide to get your attention, knowing that a suicide crisis line wants to hear from people who are thinking of suicide. So they are they really suicidal is one of the other issues, and are they being helped? Some may not be helped on the short term in one call or 1 week, but maybe over the course of a year or months, or maybe even 2 years, they may get a lot of help in the long run from the contacts. And so the question is how best to manage, or how best to help them. One of the questions we ask is, who are they, and really, why are they calling so much? And are they all similar, or are there many different subgroups or several subgroups of people who we could classify and understand, and maybe adapt the help we give so that they are better helped by the services. There's also some ethical issues. If they have a suicide risk, can we limit services? In the example I gave, that person was limited to 2 calls a day. Some people are completely cut off from calling or severely limited in services. If they're really at suicide risk, don't we need to be there for them? Should we give priority to acute crises? And how much, and what are the implications of that? So what we decided to do for a start, Louis-Philippe and I, and the support and help from Luc, was to conduct a systematic review of basically all the empirical evidence, what we know from research about frequent callers. And one of the problems is that many of the studies don't define frequent callers as people who call what most of us would be considered frequently. They define them as people who call more than once, or some of the samples have data about more than once, and people calling 100 times and in a month. And it's hard to tell who's who and who's really frequent callers. So we looked at all the data available, and we identified a total, after we took out the duplicates, of 738 different publications, and we screened them and excluded 700 of them because they didn't have data, or they were not really about frequent callers. We wound up with 38 research reports which had some data, and we excluded 11 of them because when we looked carefully, they didn't have it didn't have any data and was a literature review, and we only limited this to French and English. So, and 2 were non-telephone interventions. So we wound up with 27, and of the 27, actually 9 of them, 1/3 of them, defined frequent callers as 8 or more calls in a month. Actually, 8 of them defined it as 10 or more, or over 10, but one had defined it as 8. And 8 of them talked about all repeated callers. So anyone who called more than once was studied, and one of them, it was more than 19 calls over 2 years, which we felt was could be very, very infrequent. And 9 of them reported on frequent callers without defining what a frequent caller is. They said, we reported on our frequent callers, but they didn't say what a frequent caller actually is. So, spoiler alert, there's not much pertinent research. Of the 27 studies, we already told you about the frequent caller, the number that actually had data. So the first question we could ask is, are frequent callers different from other callers? Are there some indications of this? And in a politician's answer, yes and no. Everyone says more research is needed, and you can't help but agree with that. An Australian survey found that they had similar reasons for calling as other users. And to date, no one has reported that there are differences in the number or percentage or types of mental health problems that they have compared to non-frequent callers. There's some indications that they may use more mental health services, be more isolated and socially disadvantaged, may be more often anxious, may have experienced more traumatic events, but they appear to be as often at risk of suicide as other callers. And they generally, when people try to categorize their calls, they call to talk about their mental health problems, feeling lonely, seeking advice, or talking about difficulties. Now, there's a number of articles talking about helpline workers and how they feel about calls from frequent callers, and they find basically that that they have problems with them. They feel they're difficult because they often have all sorts of complex problems, multitude of problems. They don't feel particularly competent in how they're handling the calls. Should I be empathetic? Should I be more directive? Should I limit the calls? Should we practice coping skills? How should this be done? Sometimes feel they're being manipulated by the callers into staying on the line longer. Sometimes feel frustrated or resentment. And there is this lingering administrative need to reduce the number of calls and the duration of calls. And there's even some suggestions, some people burn out and stop being volunteers or paid workers on helplines because of all the frequent callers, which they have to handle all the time, which they don't feel comfortable with. One of the questions is, should the repeated callers be handled differently? Different approaches should be used. And there is no conclusive empirical evidence. Again, most of the outcome measures have to do with the frequency and duration of calls. So people seem more concerned about the management as the key issue. And we don't have any data on whether or not they're really benefiting. Though there is some data about them appreciating, and obviously they must be getting something out of it or they wouldn't be calling back so much. And there's a lot of talk about how to better help them and suggestions of things to try, but there's little hard data saying we have evidence that this works or not. So that's all we can do is look at and examine recommendations that have been made and that people have tried, and they said, hey, this helps or this works, without any really hard data saying, well, is it helping? Is it working? Is it any better than any of the others approaches? And one of the things which we had an example of in this little call bit that we had that we listened to is encouraging frequent callers to stop or severely limit calling the helpline. The advantages of this is it does increase center capacity to help other callers, and it will decrease the negative experiences of helpline workers with frequent callers. The disadvantage being can be seen as abandoning people who do have serious physical and mental health problems and need help. There's no question that they need some form of help. And frequent callers say that they are getting help. They call back and say, thank you, you helped me, I need you, you're supporting me. And people say, well, they should be calling somewhere else, or but it's not obvious that there are other services that they can call, and often they call elsewhere and people don't talk to them. And some people call multiple services every day, seem to be spending a lot of time calling. A less draconian approach would be to limit the number and duration of calls, which we saw in that example, where we say you can call once a day or once a week or twice a day or whatever, and it has the same advantages and disadvantages of trying to discourage them from calling. And people say that it's a better way of helping the frequent callers better control their behaviors. And one of the issues is that some frequent callers are at high risk of attempting suicide. A substantial number, like many callers to helplines, have previously attempted suicide. So there's a risk they're going to do it again, and you want to be there for them if they're in an acute crisis. And some people have expressed concern that maybe if you limit the number of calls, they might be in a real crisis, and you won't be there to provide help to them. A third approach is to assign a specific counselor to respond to all calls for each individual frequent caller. The advantages is that you'll have someone who really knows them, be able to have a consistent approach and follow up on what was previously discussed, and this could be more helpful to them. The disadvantage is that this could foster a dependency on this one person who isn't always going to be there and may not continue with the helpline, and deprive the caller of experiencing interactions with others with somewhat different approaches that may be more helpful. And also we're getting close to psychotherapy here and counseling, and some helplines feel that that's not part of their mandate to do that. We do crisis intervention. We're not. Some helplines feel that they're not here to do therapy or counseling. It takes different skills and different training. A fourth approach is to create individualized case management plans for each frequent caller, where usually the team reviews what's going on, and there's a decision about how anyone who gets a call from this particular caller should handle the call, what approach they should take. Very often it's focused on the here and now. What do you do today? What are you going to do now? And rather than any analysis of the past, and but really dealing with the problems at hand. The advantage is that everyone will be on the same page and have same approach, and the callers can get a plan really adapted to their individual needs. The disadvantage being that if you're focusing on, okay, what do you do today, maybe you lose sight of the big picture that the person has some, for example, a clinical depression that really needs treatment. And if you just focus on, okay, what are you going to do today? How are you going to spend your time? You might lose sight of the big picture of the needs of the person. And it takes a lot of staff time to develop, to monitor, and to actually implement. And it's really time consuming, and people who are in favor it say it's worth it, and others say, well, we're not so sure. A fifth approach, which is becoming more popular in some centers, is instead of having frequent callers call, making an agreement with the callers to initiate regular contacts, calling them on a regular basis rather than waiting for them to call, or even rather than allowing them to call, and in this way being able to control the volume and what's going on. The advantage is it solves the overburdening problem, and it fosters a consistent approach and continuity. And the disadvantage is if someone has a crisis and they're not allowed to call, or they're not supposed to call, you may not be there when they're in that crisis. It also requires dedicated resources. And for some centers, it's against a philosophy, which a lot of therapists have this philosophy that the client or caller needs to take some initiative to get help rather than having people taking that initiative away by calling them and offering that help. The sixth is having members of the caller support network involved in the interactions. Could be family or close friends, and to really offer support to the family and friends, encouraging them to better support the caller, and also helping them talk about their issues and giving support and encouraging them to use certain types of practices. So this is, instead of focusing on the caller, trying to identify people who in their entourage could be of help to them. The advantages is these supports can be constantly available without draining any of your staff resources, may be better able to monitor day-to-day means. If a crisis is coming, they might be better able to identify this, and this could reduce calls from the caller themselves. One of the issues is, in the same way that frequent callers often or sometimes at least antagonize people in helplines, and people don't want to spend a lot of time with them. Some of them don't have supporters who are willing to help, and potential helpers may be troubled and overburdened by the frequent caller and may need as much support for themselves as people are giving to the caller. Sixth is to provide brief, structured interventions to reduce anxiety and depression, including coping with chronic stress. So-called trauma-informed care models have been proposed, where it's more of a teaching role of the helpers, and using a very specific interventions on tools and techniques and ways to cope with the issues that the frequent callers face. It may have benefits, certainly for callers, for reducing anxiety and depression. Again, some crisis services feel that it is it's being offered as a substitute for psychotherapy or treatment by other professionals, and that doesn't coincide with their goals and mandate and services. And there's sometimes some concern, well, if they can get like continued courses on how to cope and they can profit from it, maybe everyone would benefit from that. If we start getting into that business, we're sort of doing something different from what we had planned to do. Another proposal is to simply continue to accept calls from frequent callers whenever there's personnel available to take the call. So if the lines aren't busy and there's someone available and they can take the call, and maybe if another call comes in, they might have to end it prematurely, or if there's two people working and there's no calls, but they just talk to them as long as you have people available to talk to them, and that has been proposed. The advantage is you don't have to do anything differently. If they continue to call, it's going to indicate that they get some benefits from the call, and you can give them as much time as you have available. It certainly doesn't address the frustrations and negative feelings that some helpers feel, and their feeling of not being able to help them well or deal with them. So that doesn't directly address that. Ninth suggestion is to provide regular clinical supervision and support with each helpline worker for their interventions with frequent callers on a systematic basis. Really sit down with everyone who gets calls from the frequent callers and offer them support and advice and regular clinical supervision. And the advantage is this does directly address workers' feelings about calls from frequent callers and could help workers better meet the caller's needs. The disadvantage is it doesn't deal with the capacity issue. It doesn't limit the number or duration of calls. And then in discussing this, some of the centers have expressed concerns that may be seen as providing better service for frequent callers than other callers. If workers don't get the same supervision and support for all calls, why frequent caller workers should get that support for their frequent callers and not all their callers, and they could benefit from it. And generally, it's impractical to offer such intense and regular clinical support to everyone because there's usually limited resources available for doing this. And finally, having paid staff rather than volunteers respond to calls from frequent callers. And the advantage is they're regularly available and they can have specific case management plans and protects other workers from negative experiences with frequent callers. And the issue is cost. And there's also no research data showing that paid staff are better for any callers. In fact, all the research to date basically shows that volunteers are better than paid staff, with the exception of a Quebec study that showed that they were both equivalent in Quebec. And there's equity issues, again, why frequent callers should have special dedicated paid staff and not others who are in acute crises. So we conclude, and we're going to finish in about 3 minutes here, 3 or 4 minutes, that we need more research. Everyone says that. We need to better understand who they are and what's the content of their calls. Are there subgroups of frequent callers? And we need to better understand what qualities of worker behaviors or helper behaviors and approaches are associated with better outcomes. Better outcomes meaning things like fewer calls, less suicide risk, and being of better help to callers when they're in crisis and with their chronic difficulties. And we need to not just see if some things help or work, but compare different approaches to see what approaches may seem most effective. We currently, Louis-Philippe and I, have a fairly extensive project which we are undertaking at this very moment with the United States National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is a network of those 300 centers across the United States. And the first phase, which we're in the process of starting, is understanding the nature of call from frequent callers. We define them as more than 20 calls per month. And we're analyzing recordings of all calls from frequent callers. Everyone who called over 20 times a month, they record their calls in the US, and we're going to be able to characterize the nature of the callers and how workers respond specifically to each of them, and indications of the outcome. We can look at call patterns after that call, see if people call fewer or more times as well. From this, we're going to try to determine if some approaches provide more help overall or within certain categories of callers or types of callers or issues discussed. And we're going to make recommendations for best practices supported by this data. The third phase The U.S. Lifeline network will identify who called more than 20 times in the past 30 days, and all their calls will be routed to a specific dedicated service with workers trained according to the best practices we identified, and this will be evaluated to see if the workers handle the calls according to what they were trained to do, and if the approach appears to be more beneficial to frequent callers than the previous approaches which have been used. So you can tune in a year from now, and we should have a lot more data to share with you on this project at the 2021 National Conference on Suicide Prevention, held at UQAM in Montreal from October 27th to 29th, pre-conference on the 26th, hosted, this is the annual conference of the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, with the Quebec Association for Suicide Prevention, and also co-hosted by our research center, CRI, Center for Research and Intervention on Suicide Ethical Issues and End-of-Life Practices at the Université du Québec à Montréal. We've just completed a article we submitted for publication summarizing our literature review. Be glad to share it with you once it's accepted for publication. If you send me an email, I'll make sure you'll be sent a copy as soon as it is available, and a copy of this video will be posted on the websites of the three organizations. And I will stop here, and Julie can ask them some questions.
Thank you, Brian. I have to admit, coming from a suicide prevention center myself, it's quite thrilling. I have myself a lot of questions, but let's go to people first. Just to remind people that, yes, the presentation is recorded and you will find it on the three organizers' website in a few weeks. So CRIS, AQPS, and CASP will have all the webinars that have been organized this week on their website in a few weeks. So that's where you're going to be able to find them. One question, what's the difference, if there's any, between a crisis line and a suicide line?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think sometimes there's absolutely no difference. And it's just a question of nomenclature of what people call each other. Distress centers on Ontario, if you read the description, what their major interest is in preventing suicide. In England, Samaritans is the name of the organization, and they, you know, their goal is suicide prevention, but they are open to talk with anyone about anything. I think centers that tend to announce that we are for suicide prevention get more suicidal calls, and some centers announce we're here no matter what your problem is. But one of the things in common is that usually there's an interest in being there during crises, and you know, I sometimes there's a big difference, sometimes they're exactly the same, but I think they're all interested in suicide prevention, and everyone gets calls from frequent callers, and what they do with them, that's another question. Do you think that answers it, Judy? You know a lot about what's going on in crisis services.
Yeah,
in
I
Canada.
think that's pretty fair answer. Which bring one of the question, you know, when you were talking about the big picture or the here and now, well, we know, well, first, here and now is just not how you're going to entertain yourself after the call. It's should be more than that. But despite that, hotline, crisis line, or suicide line has a very specific mandate. And that mandate should be one service, part of the larger services offered by the community. So I think sometimes one of the problems, the silos between the services. And is it something that has been shown in any of the lit review, or is it something you're going to look at during your evaluation, how, if it makes a difference between when the centers just work by themselves, or if they're really connected with other resources that could have those clients in their workload?
Yeah. You know, one of the things we hear a lot, and I've been listening to calls because we've been training people to code the calls, is that people call elsewhere, and people don't want them to continue calling because they're a bother. So I'm not sure that the issues that crisis centers, suicide prevention centers have with these frequent callers are not universal. And I guess one of the issues, and there's an ethical issue, there's a practical issue, is, you know, it's some centers say, look, you know, there are other services in the community. You should call them. There's a mental health helpline or depressive anonymous or something else. And usually the answer is, well, I am calling them too. Or yeah.
Sorry. Yes.
Go ahead, Louis Philippe.
There is some data in the literature that that says that the frequent caller already use the other services in the community, and that they use the call center for specific need, or because they benefit in different ways. That they call it, they can call they can get help in the evening or in the night, or so it seems like call center respond to needs that are not answered by the other service in the communities.
Yeah, and there's also the specificity of suicide. You know, some of the data shows that a substantial portion are at suicide risk, have attempted suicide, and it may be that some of the other services don't have the expertise to deal with it or even feel comfortable talking about it sometimes, which of course can change by providing training for other organizations within a community. But I haven't seen, maybe Louis Philippe, you saw it, people talk about connecting people with other services, and there's certainly a lot of referrals, but I haven't actually seen any collaborative approaches on the same person reported.
Not in the research.
Yeah.
I've seen like evaluation of some kind of collaboration protocol between call center and the resources.
No, so that's something we love to hear about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just in some ways respecting mandates. You know, centers are there in evening at night when people need to call. So why would they start to do something more like therapy as the other communities? That's their mandate. I have a question here. How would the helplines workers choose to intervene with a frequent caller who also has an intellectual disability?
I have not seen that mentioned specifically in the things people have been writing about. However, it really varies from the center. I mean, some centers, basically anyone calls with, no matter what their problems are, no matter how they're expressing themselves, no matter how often they call, they will take the time to show that they care and listen to the person's problems, try to identify other resources within the community, but will always be there for the person and not deal with it any differently. And others are very specific. This is what we do. If you don't fit into the criteria for, you know, who we are there to help, somehow you just You know, you go call somewhere else, go talk to someone else. But there's no, I haven't seen any research on or any even discussion on this.
And there's probably caller with intellectual disabilities in the sample that we have analyzed, because it's to analyze the impact of the call centers or the practice with that particular subgroup. We would need to know that they have disabilities when they call, and it's not always the case.
Yeah, and it's not something that's I've heard discussed, but I think one of the challenges listening to calls and trying to understand what's going on, if they're already frequent callers, so they've called at least 20 times in the last 30 days before we start listening, so we've identified them, we're not getting the beginning of their story. We're listening to calls where there's at least 20 other calls last month, and there may be 500 previous calls. So we're not getting, you know, necessarily their complete story. So if that's not a current issue, it's not something we're going to be hearing about down the line. And I don't know any way around that. I can't think of anything. Maybe we got some ideas.
Mm-hmm. I'm just noticing there's a lot of interest in the hypothesis that came up. So a lot of people are suggesting all different aspects of it, and we'll make sure we keep that noted after the presentation. But as for questions, you mentioned that in your research, you're going to look at characteristics of frequent callers. Two questions from that. One, is there a breakdown on demographics of frequent callers? And
Okay.
Second, how would you make sure that the characteristic of frequent callers are different from the ones that are not frequent callers?
Okay, well, our interest in this study is not to answer that question. There have been other studies. There's some research in Australia where they actually did compare frequent callers to other callers, and you know, there were some differences. I think the bottom line issue, which we're interested in, is, you know, what's going on in the calls. What are people doing that's helpful? What are people doing that's less helpful? And you know, what are the outcomes of the calls and how we can be of more help? And we're listening to calls. We're not asking any questions. We can't butt in and say, how old are you? And no one's keeping records of this. So this is a type of research where we're not going out and interviewing them and doing questionnaires with them. But we do have a survey put on the calls for frequent callers. And I didn't mention that but at the end of the call, and at the beginning of the call, they get a message, please stay on the line and answer a few questions. And at the end of the line, they get a recording immediately saying, we'd like to ask you a few questions, and you know, we ask their appreciation for the call, and they can even record suggestions about how they could be better helped by the calls. So we're going to be having that data, but that's not a question we're asking in this research, but someone else could try to go out and interview frequent callers or send them questionnaires and get that data if they're interested in that.
Thank you. I noticed that some of the research suggested that the mental health concerns are similar with between frequent callers and less frequent callers. At our center, we do seem to notice a high level of frequent caller who identifies as being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Are there any best practices for crisis line in working with this specific population?
Mm-hmm. Well, my tendency is say Louis Philippe. No, Julie. No, it's a frustrating group, I think that all the 10 recommendations that I listed have all been suggested for populations which include people with borderline diagnoses. And I think here we get into that issue. And this is the key, one of the key issues. The issue is, what's the role of the crisis line or suicide prevention center or helpline in general? And and you have to try to figure out what's your goal with the caller. If your goal is to stop a suicide crisis and prevent suicides and get people connected with resources in their community to get help for their problems, that's one thing. If it's to help people deal with their problems or offer them support because they're not getting it elsewhere, it's another thing. And this is people with borderline personality disorder, these are difficult for therapists in general. There are proven therapeutic methods such as dialectic behavioral therapy, DBT, but you're not going to do that over the phone on a crisis line. So I have to be clear what your goal is. Is your goal to get them to get help? Is your goal to help them get through the day? Is your goal to intervene during suicidal crises, which come up sometimes? Are you there just to support and listen? And some lines say, we're here to listen, whatever your problem is, we'll be there, we'll listen, that's it. So you have to figure out what you're doing. Philippe, what do you got to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, like, there's a lot of people that think, and I think that's a good hypothesis, that there's a lot of frequent caller that have borderline personality, but in the literature, it's not even demonstrated. I think there's one study that have looked at borderline personality trait by using questionnaire, but and they haven't found differences between frequent caller and non-frequent caller. But I think the first thing to do is just to see if there is more borderline personality people within frequent caller, and after maybe we can think about best way how to help them.
Yeah, I think that's, one of the key issues. People who are perceived as manipulative and repetitive and needy, sometimes people tend to throw the diagnosis of borderline on them. But to get a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, you really need to have someone who's skilled in doing diagnosis, do that diagnosis. And the fact that someone has some of the traits or characteristics of someone who might have that diagnosis doesn't mean that they're borderline. Though some people say from the start in the calls, yeah, I have this diagnosis of borderline, and people don't want to mirror and so forth.
And I wonder if, like, if we took some element from CBT, third wave CBT, that has been used and that has success with people with borderline personality. What if we would take some element of that and put that in our crisis intervention model? What would it look like? I don't know the answer, but that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, we'd like to hear about someone who tries some of this stuff.
Well, if I may.
Please, Julie.
So I used to work in a suicide prevention center, and of course we had all that spectrum of callers, and borderline personality disorder people are not always frequent callers. Very often it's two different groups. Some are not. And yes, we did develop strategies to find a way to help them as best as possible without burning out ourselves too, because it's also a challenge with those clients or difficulties. So maybe reaching out to some suicide prevention center in Quebec would bring some answer. But one of the key elements to really help those people is to work in collaboration with other community services, because they're very often everywhere. And the worst thing for anybody is to get different directions and different information, contradictory sometimes. So if people work together and go in the same direction, it's very helpful for those people. So that's part of how we help those categories of people better.
So it would be, if I understand, to develop a case management plan in collaboration with other resources that help the same color,
including the client.
Including the client.
So I would offer you, Louis-Philippe, that we call this person and this person from other organization. We're all going to sit together and chat about how can we help you better. But you would be part of that conversation. So on that, we're pretty much at the end of our presentation. So just checking with our two presenters if you have a last famous line to give to our audiences before we leave.
I don't think so. I would like to hear from people if they have any ideas or experiences that we didn't cover here. And, this is an area where there's openness for innovation in some ways. I think is very important when you do offer help for frequent callers or change practices or train people on how to deal with or handle those calls, that you try to be very clear about what your goals are. And they may not be the same for other callers. The model of doing crisis services is to heroically deal with someone who's on the verge of killing themselves, and after your marvelous intervention, they've thrown the pills down the toilet and their sister is with them to stay with them for the night, and they're going to do a follow-up with their shrink tomorrow, and they thank you for saving their lives. And that's the there's a certain model of that heroic a single intervention, and the sort of thing that Julie has talked about of maybe it's going to take a community. So to help people and not your heroic Superman qualities as a helpline worker. But also there is the the question of figuring out what your goals are. Is it okay if someone's going to get help in a year of constant contact with you? They're going to really get their act together a lot, but it's going to take a year of calling every day. And it's not psychotherapy, it's another form of support. And sometimes they're going to have crises or suicidal crises during that year. Sometimes maybe the help is, instead of attempting suicide every month, they'll be attempting twice a year, and maybe stop completely at some point. And,
yeah, exactly.
So you have to figure out what you're trying to do, and you have to be pretty clear about it.
And sometimes it's not only the goal of the center, it's the goal of the person. What would you like to achieve when you call us? We had callers that say, I want to stop attempting suicide on a regular basis. And that's why we worked on. Thank you very much. I'm asking our technician to save all the comments in the Q&R because there's a lot of ideas for the evaluation to come. I want to thank you, our two presenters. That was very interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of people looking forward for Montreal presentation about data on the work you'll be doing this year. And thank you to all the participants. Reminding you that there's still one day of webinars tomorrow. You can still sign up, and hope to see you in person in Montreal in 2021.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Louis-Philippe.